December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. At that hour, the Pacific Fleet was not preparing for expansion. It was maintaining readiness. Battleships lay at anchor. Aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip. Ammunition was locked. Fuel was stored, rationed, accounted for. The United States was not mobilized for a global war. It was positioned to avoid one. When Japanese aircraft crossed the coastline, they did not strike an empire. They struck a system that had deliberately delayed becoming one. The United States entered World War II under constraint, not ambition. Its economy was still shaped by the Great Depression. Its army ranked behind Portugal's. Its population was divided over intervention. Its industrial base was vast, but underutilized, politically restrained, and logistically unprepared for sustained overseas war. What followed was not a plan for dominance. It was a sequence of decisions made under narrowing options. And once those decisions were set in motion, retreat became impossible. In 1941, the American state did not resemble a future superpower. Federal authority was limited. Military budgets had been capped for 2 decades. Infrastructure investment was uneven. Rail capacity was aging. Merchant shipping had declined since World War I. The nation possessed potential, but potential is not power. That distinction mattered. Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the danger of acting too early. The trauma of World War I still shaped American politics. Intervention had produced debt, disillusionment, and a rapid demobilization that left the country economically exposed. The lesson absorbed by Congress was not how to win wars, but how to avoid paying for them afterward. Neutrality acts passed throughout the 1930s reflected that memory. They constrained arms sales, shipping routes, and diplomatic commitments. Each law narrowed presidential discretion in exchange for political stability at home. They also delayed preparation. By 1940, Europe was already at war. France had collapsed. Britain stood alone. Germany dominated the continent with an economy already converted to total war. The United States, by contrast, was still debating whether rearmament itself might provoke conflict. That delay became the first constraint. Industrial mobilization did not begin with Pearl Harbor. It began earlier, quietly, and with uncertainty. In 1940, the United States produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. Germany produced more than 10,000. American factories were optimized for consumer goods, not precision weapons. Tooling had to be redesigned. Skilled labor had to be trained. Supply chains had to be rebuilt from raw materials upward. Steel was not unlimited. Aluminum production required electricity that had not yet been generated. Rubber was imported. Oil had to be refined and shipped across oceans. Mobilization required time. Time was the one resource America did not control. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 was not a declaration of strength. It was an admission of vulnerability. The United States could not afford to lose Britain, not strategically, not economically, and not industrially. British collapse would force America to rearm alone, under blockade, across 2 oceans. So the U.S. extended credit. Not payment. Not profit. Credit. Ships, tanks, food, fuel, aircraft, all sent overseas without immediate compensation. The American economy did not grow wealthy from these transfers. It absorbed debt, risk, and strain. Factories expanded not because they were profitable, but because they were necessary. This distinction would later be forgotten. Pearl Harbor removed debate, but it did not remove constraints. The United States now faced war in 2 theaters separated by 10,000 miles. Its navy was damaged. Its army was untested. Its shipping capacity was insufficient for sustained global operations. The decision to pursue a Germany-first strategy was made quickly and quietly. It appeared rational. Germany posed the greater industrial and technological threat. But this decision committed the United States to a long war in Europe while fighting a defensive campaign in the Pacific. That commitment could not be reversed. It forced production priorities. Escorts over carriers. Bombers over landing craft. Steel allocated to Europe reduced availability elsewhere. Each allocation reduced future flexibility. By 1942, American shipyards were producing vessels faster than German submarines could sink them, but only barely. Convoy losses peaked in the Atlantic. Tanker shortages disrupted fuel distribution at home. Rationing was imposed not because of scarcity, but because logistics could not keep pace with demand. The system was expanding under pressure, not design. Meanwhile, the war reshaped the American labor force. Millions were drafted. Millions more moved. Women entered factories at unprecedented scale. Southern populations migrated north and west. Cities strained under housing shortages. Railroads ran at maximum capacity. These changes created output, but they also created friction. Inflation threatened stability. The Office of Price Administration imposed controls. Wages were capped. Strikes were deferred, not resolved. Every solution postponed a reckoning. Yet compared to Europe and Asia, the United States possessed one decisive advantage that no amount of planning could replicate elsewhere. Its factories were intact. Its rail lines were unbombed. Its ports functioned. Its cities slept at night. By 1944, Germany was producing weapons under bombardment. Japan was dispersing industry into villages. Britain had been at war for 5 years. The United States was accelerating. Not because it was smarter, but because it was untouched. The war ended asymmetrically. In May 1945, Europe lay in ruin. Industrial output in Germany had collapsed. France's rail network was shattered. Britain faced insolvency. The Soviet Union had lost over 20 million people and much of its Western infrastructure. The United States emerged with its industrial base expanded, its workforce trained, its logistics perfected, and its military deployed globally. But it also faced a familiar dilemma. What now? The decision after World War I had been demobilization. The result had been recession, political withdrawal, and vulnerability. This time the constraints were different. Factories could not simply close. Millions of veterans required employment. Global trade networks had been disrupted. Currency systems were unstable. In 1944, before the war ended, American planners had already committed to a solution. Bretton Woods. The dollar would anchor the global financial system. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank would stabilize currencies and reconstruction. American capital would flow outward, not as charity but as structure. This was not altruism. It was necessity. Without global recovery, American overproduction would collapse its own economy. The Marshall Plan followed not as generosity, but as containment of depression, instability, and political radicalization. These commitments locked the United States into a permanent global role. Withdrawal was no longer an option. By the time this reality became visible, the point of return had already passed. American bases stretched across Europe and the Pacific. The Navy controlled sea lanes. The dollar dominated trade. Industrial capacity exceeded domestic demand. The United States had become a superpower not by conquest, but by exhaustion. Its rivals broken by war, it had survived intact. The misconception that America profited from World War II misunderstands timing. Wealth did not come during the war. It came after, when every other industrial system required rebuilding, and only one nation possessed the capacity, stability, and credit to do so. Not because it planned to rule, but because history removed alternatives. The outcome was not inevitable at the start. It became inevitable only after each decision constrained the next. Delayed mobilization. Credit instead of payment. Germany first. Global logistics. Postwar financial commitments. At no point did the United States choose empire. It chose continuity. And in a world shattered by total war, continuity became power. July 1, 1944. Mount Washington Hotel, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The war was still raging. American troops were fighting through Normandy. The Red Army was advancing west. Japan had not yet lost its carrier fleet. Yet inside a secluded hotel in rural New Hampshire, the United States was already confronting a problem that would not fully appear for another year. Victory. The question was not how to win the war. It was what would happen afterward, when factories no longer had enemies to supply, when millions of soldiers returned home, and when the global economy attempted to restart without a functioning center. The conference at Bretton Woods was not visionary. It was preventative. Every major decision discussed there was shaped by a single constraint. The United States could not afford another post-war collapse like the one that followed World War I. That collapse had not come from defeat. It had come from withdrawal. In 1919, the United States emerged as the world's largest creditor. By 1920, it had already begun dismantling its war apparatus. Troops returned. Factories closed. European debts went unpaid. Trade contracted. Capital retreated behind tariffs. Within a decade, the global economy imploded. By 1944, American policymakers understood that outcome was not an accident. It was a system failure created by disengagement. This time, disengagement was no longer an option. The United States had expanded its industrial capacity far beyond domestic peacetime demand. Aircraft plants, shipyards, steel mills, chemical facilities, these were not marginal expansions. They were structural transformations. Shutting them down would not restore equilibrium. It would trigger mass unemployment. The constraint was immediate and unforgiving. Production had to continue or the economy would contract violently. That requirement shaped everything that followed. The dollar's elevation at Bretton Woods was not a declaration of supremacy. It was a compromise forced by imbalance. Gold reserves had flowed into the United States throughout the war. European currencies were unstable. Britain was financially exhausted. The Soviet Union rejected participation entirely. A neutral system was impossible. So the dollar became the anchor, not because it was ideal but because no alternative existed. Fixed exchange rates tied global trade to American monetary policy. Stability abroad became dependent on discipline at home. This arrangement reduced uncertainty for others. It increased responsibility for the United States. Once accepted, it could not be reversed without collapse. When the war ended in August 1945, the material disparity was stark. Industrial output in Western Europe had fallen by more than a third. Rail networks were shattered. Ports were clogged with debris. Electrical grids were unreliable. Food production lagged behind population needs. In Asia, the destruction was deeper. Japan's cities were burned. China's economy was fragmented by years of occupation and civil war. The United States faced a choice that appeared optional, but was not. Either global recovery occurred quickly, or American industry would face a contraction severe enough to destabilize the domestic economy. The Marshall Plan emerged from this constraint, not from generosity. Between 1948 and 1951, the United States transferred over $13 billion to Western Europe. The funds were not unrestricted. They required cooperation, coordination, and alignment. Reconstruction was conditional. This conditionality reduced American freedom of action. Once funds were committed, withdrawal risked political collapse abroad and recession at home. The system locked itself in. At the same time, military demobilization proceeded unevenly. Millions of servicemen returned home within months. Others remained stationed overseas. Bases constructed for wartime necessity became semi-permanent fixtures. The United States did not initially intend to maintain a global military presence. But withdrawing from Europe risked power vacuums. Withdrawing from Asia risked instability along critical trade routes. Each retained base became a commitment. Each commitment narrowed future choices. The emergence of the Soviet Union as a rival power accelerated this process, but it did not originate it. The Cold War did not create American global engagement. It formalized it. By 1947, the Truman Doctrine articulated a principle that had already become operational. Instability anywhere could threaten recovery everywhere. This was not ideological expansion. It was economic risk management. Containment required resources. Resources required production. Production required markets. The cycle reinforced itself. Domestic constraints tightened as well. Veterans required housing, education, and employment. The GI Bill expanded access to universities and home ownership, stimulating demand but also reshaping the labor force. Suburbanization accelerated. Infrastructure followed. Highways connected industrial centers to residential zones. Energy consumption increased. These developments appeared domestic. They were not. They tied American growth to global oil supplies, maritime security, and uninterrupted trade. Energy security became a strategic requirement. Once again, the range of options narrowed. By the early 1950s, the United States had not declared itself a superpower. But its behavior reflected one. Its navy patrolled every major sea lane. Its currency structured global trade. Its corporations operated across continents. Its military alliances spanned oceans. These were not the results of conquest. They were the residual effects of decisions made to prevent collapse. At each stage, American leaders acted to stabilize what already existed. They did not expand ambition. They defended continuity. The accumulation of those defenses became dominance. The final constraint was psychological. After 2 global wars in a single generation, withdrawal no longer appeared safe. Isolation was no longer neutral. It carried risk. Public opinion shifted accordingly. Political resistance to global engagement weakened. The costs of leadership became normalized. The system adjusted. By the time alternatives reappeared, the structure was complete. The United States did not become a superpower because it sought power. It became one because the world it helped rebuild could not function without it. That dependency was not designed. It emerged. And once it did, there was no way back. June 25, 1950. 38th parallel, Korean Peninsula. The war began without warning. North Korean forces crossed the border at dawn, overwhelming South Korean defenses within hours. Seoul fell in 3 days. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session. Soviet delegates were absent. The vote passed. American forces were committed almost immediately. This was not a sudden expansion of ambition. It was the activation of a system already in place. By 1950, the United States no longer possessed the option of delay. The response to Korea revealed what had quietly solidified during the previous decade. American troops stationed in Japan were redeployed within days. Naval task forces were already operating in the Pacific. Supply lines extended across oceans without improvisation. Industrial production surged again, not through emergency mobilization, but through existing capacity. The infrastructure of power was already built. The war did not create it. It exposed it. At no point between 1941 and 1950 did the United States formally decide to become a superpower. There was no doctrine announcing permanent dominance. No declaration of global stewardship. No strategic blueprint mapping the transition from republic to hegemon. Instead, there was a sequence of constrained choices. Each choice addressed an immediate vulnerability. Each solution required a commitment that reduced future flexibility. Delayed mobilization to avoid domestic backlash. Credit-based aid to keep allies solvent. Global logistics to compensate for geographic distance. Financial architecture to prevent economic collapse. Military presence to stabilize reconstruction. None of these decisions expanded options. They closed them. By the early 1950s, the United States had crossed the threshold without noticing. Its industrial output accounted for nearly half of global manufacturing. Its currency functioned as international reserve. Its navy guaranteed maritime trade. Its military alliances structured regional security. Yet this dominance was brittle in one crucial sense. It depended on continued engagement. Withdrawal would now trigger the very instability earlier policies had been designed to prevent. Economic contraction abroad would reduce demand. Political collapse would invite conflict. Conflict would disrupt trade. The system had no off switch. This was the final miscalculation, though it did not appear as one at the time. American leaders believed they were preserving stability. They did not anticipate how permanence would reshape expectations. Allies adjusted their planning around American presence. Markets priced risk assuming American intervention. Institutions deferred responsibility upward. Over time, restraint became harder to exercise. Power, once assumed, generated demand simply by existing. The popular belief that the United States won World War II economically misunderstands causality. The war did not make America rich. It forced America to remain involved. Wealth followed not from selling weapons, but from occupying the only position left intact after global destruction. Every other industrial power had been exhausted, dismantled, or bankrupted. The United States did not outcompete them. It outlasted them. This distinction matters, because it reframes American ascendancy not as triumph, but as inheritance. The postwar order did not emerge because the United States designed it perfectly. It emerged because alternatives failed, collapsed, or were never viable. American power filled a vacuum created by catastrophe. And once filled, that vacuum could not be reopened without collapse. By the mid-20th century, the United States had become what it had once tried to avoid: a permanent global actor whose domestic prosperity depended on external stability. This condition was not chosen in a single moment. It accumulated. Decision by decision. constraint by constraint, commitment by commitment. Long before the consequences were visible. History often treats superpowers as architects. In reality, they are frequently survivors. The United States did not emerge from World War II as a superpower because it sought to dominate the world. It emerged because the world that remained required something it alone could provide: continuity. And in the aftermath of total war, continuity was the rarest resource of all.